Hello, and welcome back to Mammalian Anatomy at Keuka College. We are going to continue our lecture series on Chapter 13, the Central Nervous System, and currently we are in Part 3 where we're discussing sensory and motor pathways. In this video, we're going to focus on descending pathways. So as we discussed in a previous video, descending pathways will actually carry motor information from the brain to the spinal cord to the peripheral nervous system. And so this pathway is going to be responsible for initiating movement, whether it is in our skeletal muscle or in our smooth muscle that is going to be in our digestive tract, for example, or it's going to go to glands and stimulate the release of hormones, enzymes, buffers, and all sorts of things. So this pathway is going to be composed of neurons that are synapsing together in series. So one neuron will synapse with another, and it's going to allow for a predictable patterned response. In descending pathways, we're only going to have two neurons for each pathway. There's going to be an upper motor neuron, which is going to be kind of located in the central nervous system, and it will carry information from the brain to the spinal cord, and a lower motor neuron that will actually travel out of the central nervous system and innervate the peripheral nervous system. So it will go from the spinal cord specifically to muscles and glands. Descending tracts can be actually classified into two major groups: direct pathways and indirect pathways. So what we're going to do here is we're going to define these pathways and give one example for each. We're not going to go through all of the descending tracts because there are so many. So I'm just going to give one example of a direct pathway and one example of an indirect pathway. So let's talk about direct pathways. So direct pathways are going to have nerves that are going to start in the pyramidal cells in the cerebral cortex, and it will kind of extend to the spinal cord and then to the peripheral nervous system. These pyramidal cells are going to be large neurons that are found in the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is found in the cerebrum, and it's going to help initiate planned movements. The axons of these pyramidal cells will actually go through the pyramidal tracts, through the medulla and through the spinal cord, or we can also call these tracts cortical spinal tracts. We'll see that term being used in our specific example. These tracts will decussate, meaning they will cross over, so the body is going to be controlled contralaterally, tongue-tied. It's going to go from the right side of the brain and control the left side, and then the left brain is going to control the right side. So it's going to cross over and control the body contralaterally. Again, knowing the difference between ipsilateral and contralateral control within the spinal nerves is going to be important for clinical studies or clinical understanding of the body. So what do these direct pathways do? They are going to function to control precise, skilled voluntary movements. So things such as going to the hands and allowing us to write or draw or paint, it's going to be very fine motor movements that are voluntary. So in a nutshell, they're going to start at the pyramids in the cerebral cortex and go to the spinal cord and then to the peripheral nervous system. They will cross over and control the body contralaterally, and they're going to be responsible for skilled voluntary movements. Indirect pathways do not start at these pyramidal cells. Rather, they're going to start at subcortical nuclei. So they're really going to start in the brainstem rather than the cerebral cortex. And they are actually going to also have axons that travel down the spinal cord via tracts, and their information will then be sent to the peripheral nervous system. It was initially thought that these indirect pathways were completely separate and not influenced by the pyramidal cells or the direct pathways. And so they used to be called extrapyramidal pathways. Now, after more research, we understand that axons from the pyramidal cells will actually project into these subcortical nuclei and have some sort of influence on these pathways. So it may not be directly coming from the motion may not be directly coming from the cerebral cortex, but the cerebral cortex has the ability to influence the actions of these pathways. So just FYI. So what is the function of these pathways? So this would be responsible for like subconscious and or coarse movements, and also postural body movements. So if we're sitting at our desk or standing, we don't have to actively tell our muscles to contract to maintain our body posture. These indirect subcortical pathways will actually maintain or cause small muscle movements to adjust our posture so that posture can be maintained. So these would be kind of subconscious movements. I have a lot of friends who like to bounce their knee a lot when they are just sitting in place. Don't know why. And when I asked them to stop, they didn't even know that they were doing that action. So it would be kind of a subconscious kind of movement. All right. So now that we've compared and contrast in direct and direct pathways, let's give examples of each. Again, I'm just going to give one example of each. We're not going to go through every descending pathway. So the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at the lateral cortical spinal pathway. And again, I apologize that this diagram is rather small on the PowerPoint. I would definitely go to your textbook and follow along with these pathways in your textbook. So we actually see two pathways here. There's one that is kind of in a bright red and one that is pink. The bright red is the ventral cortical spinal tract, but we're going to be focusing on the lateral cortical spinal pathway. We're going to be focusing on the pink one here. So what is the function of the lateral cortical spinal pathway? Well, really just conscious voluntary movement of the muscles. So we're going to be able to tell our muscles to move the way that we want them to do. Again, this pathway is going to be divided into an upper neuron and a lower neuron. And so let's talk about the upper neuron. The upper neuron is going to start at the pyramids that are going to be located in the primary motor cortex of the cerebrum. What will happen is this upper motor neuron will actually travel down the cerebrum and go through the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and it will then cross over in the medulla oblongata at the decussation of the pyramids. So it'll cross over here. So it will decussate over. And after it crosses over, it's going to go down the spinal cord through the lateral cortical spinal tract. So, as it goes down the spinal cord, eventually it will travel to the segment of the spinal cord where it will meet the lower motor neuron. And it will actually it will actually synapse indirectly with that lower motor neuron using an interneuron. So it starts at the primary motor cortex, the pyramids of the primary motor cortex in the cerebrum. It will cross over in the medulla oblongata, and then it will travel down the lateral cortical spinal tract in the spinal cord and synapse with an interneuron. So that's what the upper neuron will do. The lower motor neuron is actually going to synapse with that interneuron that we talked about over here. And it will originate at the ventral horn of the spinal cord. Remember, the ventral horn of the spinal cord is responsible for somatic voluntary muscle movement. And so that's where that lower motor neuron will begin. It will leave the spinal cord and travel through spinal nerves to eventually get to skeletal muscles. It will innervate those skeletal muscles and initiate voluntary movement. So it starts at the ventral horn of the spinal cord and innervates skeletal muscles. Yes, there's decussation that will occur, and it will specifically occur at the medulla oblongata at the decussation of the pyramids. All right. Thank you. Now what we're going to do is we're going to give an example of an indirect pathway. This is going to be the rubrospinal pathway. The rubrospinal pathway is going to go from the red nucleus, and it's the red nucleus is red because there are a lot of blood vessels there, and it will give it a red tone. And eventually it will travel to the it will actually travel to the skeletal muscles and stimulate those skeletal muscles to respond. Some of the functions of this rubrospinal pathway is going to be motor tone. So our muscles in our body are always going to have like muscle tone or motor tone. And what is that? So our muscles are continuously being stimulated to be slightly contracted at all times, and so that the muscles are ready for motion. I kind of like to give the example of chicken. So if you have like a living chicken and you feel its muscles, this is kind of gross, I'm sorry. If you feel the muscles like it of the chicken, you'll see that the muscles are a bit tough, and that's because the muscles are being stimulated and slightly contracted. If you look at the chicken that you would eat after the chicken has been slaughtered, the muscles are very kind of floppy compared to what you would see in a living chicken. That's because there is no motor tone in that kind of chicken for food situation. So motor tone is slight contraction of the muscles to get the muscles ready for a bigger contraction. So this is one of the functions of the rubrospinal pathway. And it also is important for visceral motor functions. So meaning it's going to go to muscles that are located within the ventral cavity, so like the digestive tract, those sorts of things. So now that we know what this kind of pathway is responsible for, let's look at the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is going to be subcortical. So it's not going to start in the cortex of the cerebrum, rather it's going to start in the brain stem, and it specifically will be start in the red nucleus of the midbrain. This upper neuron, upper motor neuron will actually cross over and travel through the pons, travel through the medulla oblongata, and then travel down the rubrospinal tract of the spinal cord. And eventually it will end in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and it will synapse with an interneuron. So it starts in the midbrain and then travels down to the spinal cord. Let's talk about the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron will go from the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and it will travel through the spinal nerve and eventually innervate the muscles. Decussation does occur. It does cross over and is specifically going to cross over in the midbrain. And what will happen is this rubrospinal pathway will then innervate the body contralaterally. So the opposite side of the brain will stimulate the opposite side of the body. So again, be familiar with which pathways are contralateral, which pathways are ipsilateral, and know the clinical significance of that. So that concludes our lecture of descending pathways, and it also concludes our lecture for chapter 13. For these descending pathways, I would like you to choose one or the other, the rubrospinal pathway or the lateral corticospinal pathway. Choose one to describe fully and completely, and that will be an example of an essay on your upcoming exam. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.